So yes, thank you, Victoria, and your team for inviting me here on this beautiful, hot, sunny day. And it actually is quite nice to be in a cool, air-conditioned environment, isn't it? Which is a rarity, isn't it? Let's face it. I'm a little bit apologetic about the screen in front of me here. This is both for two reasons. One, obviously for COVID protection, but secondly, to protect me from any rotten tomatoes or cabbages that might be thrown by you at the end of the session. I'm going to just begin in a way I haven't really planned until I left the house this morning. Just going to read you out something which I've written, not for the book, but for another project that I'm working on. And it's got a local link, which is why I thought it was important to start with this. On the 2nd of September 1939, 25 Kindertransport children were sent by train to Norfolk. Most of the children were newly arrived in England and had been staying at a hostel for refugee girls in Hackney. They did not all speak English. Some were selected to live in the small flint cottages and green tin bungalows at Cockley Cley, but others remained in the village hall with nowhere to live. Lady Roberts, whose husband in Westminster heard of this in the corridors of power, and knowing that, quote, she had a quite nice large house, offered to accommodate them, and 10 Jewish girls aged between 6 and 14 were taken to Cockley Cley Hall. Many years later, a former Kindertransportee recalled that Lady Roberts, or Gladys as she was known, treated the girls to baskets of soft fruit from the garden, supplementing their tedious daily diet of turnips, potatoes, and cabbage. I could go on, but that is one example of the hospitality offered to the Kindertransport children in all across the UK, but here in Swaffham, which isn't very far away from where we are today. Similarly, there were refugee children who came on the Kindertransport to Norwich itself, because Norwich had a refugee committee which found homes and hostels for those children. Now, sadly, I've looked high and low, even here at the Archive Centre, and it seems that the refugee committee minutes or documents must have been destroyed at some point. So it's very difficult to find any information about it. But I will not give up trying, because I've just this morning, with Victoria's help, thought of another possible way in to this story, because it's an important story to tell. And we know here with the arrival of Ukrainian and other refugees, how important it is for civic society, never mind government, but civic society to respond to the needs of those seeking asylum and refuge, which is exactly what happened in 1938 to 39. So let's move on. Let's make sure that this goes on. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Liverpool Street Station in London. I think that's where your trains come into, isn't it? So you should be fairly familiar. And looking around the audience here, I imagine that many of you are regular diners at the McDonald's, which is just on the side of the Liverpool Street Station. But just in front of McDonald's is, in fact, you can see the arches in the background there. Just in front of McDonald's is this wonderful memorial called The Arrival, created by an artist called Frank Meisler. And it's there to commemorate the arrival of these children, these refugee children, into Britain. The most important arrival points were the port of Harwich on the Essex coast, of which I'll say a little bit more later, and the station in London, Liverpool Street Station. And that's where the memorial is beautifully wrought in bronze, 5 children looking in different directions, looking anxious, looking excited maybe, looking back at where they've come from. And this memorial is there to commemorate the arrival of these unaccompanied children who were not allowed to bring their parents with them. Now, I'll go on to reasons why that was the case a little later. So whenever I give a talk about the Kindertransport, I have time to ask questions in the interim. one name crops up in terms of who was it that organized the rescue of the children from the Nazi-occupied countries, or Nazi Germany, Nazi Austria, and later Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic. And that name, Sir Nicholas Winton, tends to come up more than any other. He became, certainly in later life, something of a celebrity. You may remember, those of you who are old enough, I don't think anyone here is that age, the Esther Ranson program, That's Life. Well, he featured in 1989 on that program, and then overnight became a mass celebrity. And in fact, really, it was that program that brought to the attention of the public the whole history of the Kindertransport, which had generally been forgotten until that point. And so his name has been associated with the Kindertransport. He was a man, a wonderful man, I met him several times, who lived to the age of 106. And at his 105th birthday, still very much around and very much compos mentis, I asked him, why is your name known in terms of rescuers, but everybody else, most people, have been forgotten? Now, he was an incredibly, quiet and quietly spoken and undemonstrative man. And he thought and he said, well, you know why? One reason, I've outlived everybody else, which is quite true. So it really became, and when I met him in about 2013, it really became a bit of an obsession of mine to try and find the other Nicholas Wintons who helped the children to get here out of danger. Nicholas Winton is so famous, actually, that he was the subject of a Google Doodle. You can't get more famous than this. That's the picture on top of the Google page that changes every day. And for what would have been his 111th birthday, he was celebrated, and there you can see in that drawing a young man with glasses on his knees, welcoming or shaking hands, or about to shake hands with some young children coming off a train. Very symbolic then of this rescue from Nazi-occupied Europe. Children came to Britain, mostly, very, very few by plane, mostly by ship and train to get to England. 10,000 children came on this scheme called the Kindertransport, the Children's Transport. It was the largest act of mass rescue in the entire Holocaust period, which I'm kind of saying is late 30s to the end of the war. And nearly all of them came to Britain. Some went to France, some went to Sweden, small numbers to Denmark, to Belgium, to USA. But the vast majority of those escaping the Nazi clutches came here to Britain. And that's a story that is definitely worth telling because it's our story, it's our shared history. 90% of those children came from what was then called the German Reich, that is Germany and its annexed Austria, which of course was annexed up to the Anschluss in March 1938. And the vast majority of those children came from Germany and Austria. Now, what's quite interesting is that only 6% of those children came from Prague, the Czech lands. And Nicholas Winton, let me just go back to him, was only ever responsible for the Czech rescue. He didn't set foot in Germany or Austria, and nothing whatsoever to do with the 9,000 children who came from Germany and Austria. It was not his responsibility. So my question when I started writing this book was, if he was responsible for 6% of the Kindertransport children, who was responsible for the other 94? Well, my maths isn't very good, but I think that's more or less right, isn't it? I mean, O-level maths failed, by the way. Look where it got me. Not very far, which is the answer. So let's have a look at the, I'm sorry about the obscuring some of the text there, but what it says is that I'm looking at how the Kindertransport began in late November 1938. It really came what seemed like out of nowhere. It actually began with the events of the 9th and 10th of November 1938. Let me take you back to that night. The night of the 9th and 10th of November 1938 was known as, or became known as, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. This, actually, well, historians are now calling this the November pogrom. It was a very, very well organized mass assault on Germany and Austria's Jewish population, which had already been suffering from exclusion, occasional beatings up, robbing them of their livelihood, but nothing on the scale of what happened on the 9th and 10th of November. Overnight, 900 synagogues were burnt to the ground. That was virtually every synagogue in Austria and Germany. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested overnight and sent to these newfangled things called concentration camps. These are camps like Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald. We're not yet at the death camp Auschwitz stage yet. That's coming much later. So there was a night of terror, a night in which very well organized mobs were given the green light by Goebbels, particularly, to ransack Jewish properties, beat up anyone they found, and burn down as much Jewish religious buildings as they could find overnight. Now, actually, in my research, I've discovered that although Kristallnacht was the key driver of these refugees, as war and persecution always is, thousands of registrations have already taken place by parents desperate to get their children out of Germany and Austria following the annexation of Vienna and Austria in March 38. So already parents were banging on the doors of the agencies to get their children out of danger. So the Kristallnacht event of the night of 9th and 10th of November was not a catalyst really, but it was the sort of peak moment in which the Jewish parents of these children really were convinced now that they had to get those children out on trains out of danger. There were desperate calls from Jewish organizations and Quaker organizations in Germany, Austria, to rescue at least the children. It was very clear after Kristallnacht that the Jews of Germany were now in mortal danger. That hadn't been clear before. A lot of the rhetoric was it might go away, Hitler might change his mind, this is probably as bad as it's going to get. But it was Kristallnacht that really convinced not just the Jews, but the world that the Jewish population, which was only 1%, by the way, of the population of Germany, were in mortal danger. There was a British offer to waive the visa of the children, not the parents, and allow them thus to get to Britain more easily. It also came on the back of a rejection by the British government to allow those Jewish children into what was then Mandate Palestine, of course, ruled by the British until 1948. So the rejection of the children into Mandate Palestine by the Home Office and Foreign Office was in fact matched, if you like, by this alternative offer by Chamberlain's government to allow the children into Britain on a temporary basis. What the Kindertransport was, in fact, from the government viewpoint, was simply a visa waiver scheme. The children didn't need visas. That's all they did. But a big thing, but the government weren't involved in any other way, except maybe being a bit worried about health and safety, which I'll come back to in a moment. There were also pleas from Jewish and Quaker organizations in this country to allow the children in. And in fact, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the marvelous name of Cosmo Lang, created a very unusually, appeared on a newsreel. You're all too young to remember newsreels, but they were the main way in which people in the 30s got their visual news in the cinema. And Archbishop Lang created a newsreel, which you can see on YouTube, appealing to the British people to support these children when they come, with funds and with homes and so on. And there was moral outrage in the press and church circles about what happened over Kristallnacht. So I'm just going to move on from that, because I think we've already seen that one. There we go. So let me look at some of the personalities involved in the story. I'm going to begin with the Home Secretary of the time, so Samuel Hoare. The Hoare family were in fact very prominent Quakers. Hoare himself was brought up as a Quaker, although he wasn't particularly a practicing one, but that doesn't matter. He had Quaker roots and Quaker sensibilities. I think it's time, by the way, I think that someone, not me, should write a new biography of Samuel Hoare because a very interesting character. He was one of Neville Chamberlain's so-called guilty men who signed or supported the what's it called, the appeasement with Hitler in September 38. However, in our story, he's Home Secretary, and there is a delegation led by Quakers and Jews and to him in the Home Office, begging him to waive visas for the children of Germany and Austria, because up to that point, it was virtually impossible to get into Britain. The visa regulations were incredibly tight, especially for asylum seekers. Have we heard that anywhere before, I wonder? And they'd been those asylum seeking, post-asylum seeking visa regulations have been brought in after the invasion of Austria, because they knew that people would be wanting to bang on our doors to seek asylum. That door was closed, except for this visa waiver scheme and one or two other schemes as well. So on the 21st of November 1938, Samuel Hoare makes a statement to the House of Commons. It was the very late evening of 1938, and he makes a statement to tell them essentially that the government has decided to waive the visas for an unlimited number of Jewish children and those of Jewish origin to come to Britain. But he makes some caveats, which I think are quite interesting. And I put the caveats mainly in red. I've put them in bold, as you can see. He says, he tells the House of Commons, I have to be careful to avoid anything in the nature of mass immigration, which in my view would inevitably lead to the growth of a movement, an anti-Jewish movement. So this was not going to be a mass rescue of parents and grandparents and so on. It was only going to be the children, because there was a fear, and it was certainly spread around by Oswald Mosley and others, that if too many Jews came into the country, it would raise the spectre of fascist-like anti-Semitism. We might provide, he told Parliament, a temporary home here. They were only going to come temporarily. This was not going to be a permanent arrival. They would go to some third country when the time was right. Talk to that. You asked me about that in the questions where these third countries might have been. He says, I believe we could find homes for these children without any harm to our own population. Now, what kind of harm could these children do? Well, you can imagine that the rhetoric is certainly in the press. There were two newspapers that were violently against the Kindertransport. One was called the Daily Express, one was called the Daily Mail. Now, I don't know what happened to those two newspapers, but they were very violently anti-immigration of all kinds in 1938-39. And the harm that was projected was that of taking our jobs, or lowering wages, or possibly some of these could be fifth columnists under the guise of looking for refuge, and so on and so on, the kind of things that are fairly familiar even now. And he finishes by saying that the voluntary committee, which again I'll talk to about in a moment, would be prepared to bring over here all the children whose maintenance could be guaranteed either by their funds or by generous individuals. In other words, telling members of Parliament that the whole scheme would be self-financed. There wouldn't be a penny of taxpayers' money put towards the rescue of these children. And with all of those caveats, he then announced, some books say he introduced it as a bill. It wasn't. It was an announcement. MPs had no say whether they liked it or not. He announced the introduction of the Kindertransport scheme, which was, as I say, unique to Britain. No one else had done this on this scale. He also finishes with, I think, quite an interesting Quaker-like flourish. He tells the MPs before he sits down, by doing the things that are morally right, we shall achieve something which is worthy of the name of the British nation. And he sits down to hear hears across the House. There were no voices of dissension. One or two people said, well, where will they go? How do we know we can look after them? All those kinds of things, but there was no general dissent. So on the 21st of November 1938, Samuel Hoare gives the green light. I wouldn't call him one of my unsung heroes, maybe, he's not a hero, but certainly he plays a vital part in the rescue of the children. Without his say-so, the children would not have come. To apply for a visa in Germany meant you had to go in person. Where have we heard this before? You had to go in person to the passport control office in Berlin or Frankfurt or Hamburg. You had to queue possibly for 2 or 3 days in the open air, being harassed by brown shirt members of the Nazi party. And then when you got to the front of the queue, there was absolutely no guarantee that you would get your visa. And even if you got your visa, it would take anything up to 3 months for the visa to arrive, allowing you to leave Germany. So it's an incredibly and deliberately slow system of keeping as many people out as they could. So the visa waiver scheme, although it sounds very bureaucratic, was actually a very generous offer given everything else that was going on in our society. So let's have a look at some of the forgotten figures that I've mentioned in my book. And I'm going to begin with this lady, Helen Bentwich. She was a member of a very distinguished Anglo-Jewish family that had been in England for about 200 years, the Bentwiches and the Franklins. In fact, her maiden name was Franklin. If that name rings any bells, you may have heard of Dorothy Franklin, who was the one of the discoverers of DNA. Dorothy? Rosalind, I've got it in the end. Rosalind Franklin was a co-founder, co-discoverer of DNA, and Rosalind was Helen's niece. So a very well-established family. The chain of office around Helen Bentwich's neck is there because she at this time was chairman, as they were called in those days, of the London County Council Education Committee. So she was in charge of London schools, very important and influential figure. And she takes on the whole issue of the children from Germany as a personal crusade and campaign. She forms a committee with the very ungainly name of the Movement for the Care of Children from Germany. It's formed a few days after Kristallnacht in late November 38. And she's in touch, because she's a very high-powered, influential person, with the Home Office, working out how this scheme is going to be implemented. But first, she surrounds herself with a committee mostly of women. And I don't know if you can see them very clearly here, but there is Helen on the right. On our left, all right, isn't it? Yeah, on my stage left, on your right, is Lola Hahn Warburg, who was a member of the Warburg banking family. The merchant banks Warburg, I think, is still around. She was an escapee from Germany because she was on the Gestapo hit list and managed just to get out in time before being shipped off to a concentration camp. She got to London in October 38, and by November 38, she joined Helen's committee to help get the children out. And she was, because she was German speaking, she knew everybody in Germany, she was very well connected. She became the linchpin of the organization of the children coming from Germany. She was the one who would negotiate with parents, with agencies in Germany, looking at specific children and how they might get here, who would look after them once they were here, how they were funded, whether they were suitable to come here or not, etc. The other ladies on her committee next along is Elaine Blonde, whose maiden name was Marks, Elaine Marks. She was sister of Simon Marks, the head of Marks and Spencer. So again, somebody very, very well connected and an incredibly well organized person. This really is a formidable committee of the great and the good. Stella Isaacs, not Jewish, but married into a Jewish family, in January 39, thinks up and forms the Women's Voluntary Service. And during the war, her name was incredibly well known as the founder of the WVS. But before she did that, she helped to found the Kindertransport Committee. And then we've got, finally, on the right-hand side, Rebecca Seif, another sister from the Marx family, again, very well connected, extremely well organized, and so on. So you've got a bunch of very, very powerful, very well organized, very committed, and one might even say sort of driven ladies who wanted to make this happen. So when we talked about civil society, you need people like this to get things moving and get things moving quickly. You know, they all knew then that time was of the essence. The fear amongst the press in the UK and amongst the population was not that the Jews would be gassed. That was unthinkable in 38, 39. No one ever thought of that. But the rhetoric was always about starvation. they will be starved to death, and the children would be first to go, and disease would set in, etc., etc. So it was very clear that time was of the essence. Now I'm going to move my lens, if you like, to Holland, to this lady, Gertrude Wijsmuller-Meijer. Again, a lady whose name has generally not been remembered, except in her own time, she was remembered. There she is next to a bust of herself in 1966, I think it was, receiving the award, the Righteous Among Nations, given by the State of Israel to those non-Jewish people who managed to save lives of Jews during the war. She was a Dutch rescuer. In fact, during the war, was one of the kind of key people responsible for the Dutch underground, the rescue of Jewish families, unfortunately not Anne Frank, but other ones like her, to private homes. Now, it was the point about Gertrude in November 38 was that she acted as a go-between between the Jewish agencies in London and the Nazis in Germany. She was non-Jewish and therefore was more able to sit in front of senior Nazis and ask them to let the children go. Because after all, it's all very well giving the children visas or visa waivers, but it was up to the Nazis to allow them to leave, and it did not make leaving easy. For instance, can you believe this? Every Jewish child had to show that they had paid their subscription to the Hitler Youth. That kind of thing. It was massive amount of bureaucracy, taxes, and all sorts of barriers put in the way of the children. So the London Committee, Helen and her husband Norman Bentwich, asked Gertrude to go and parley with the senior Nazis to allow the children to leave. And she, without hesitation, gets on the flight from Amsterdam to Vienna, where she meets the senior Nazi. There he is, bottom left, probably can't see very clearly if you're at the back, but I'll describe him. This is the senior Nazi whose official title was head of the Jewish Emigration Department, which sounds very, very innocent, doesn't it? It meant the head of the Jewish Persecution Department, pushing them out of the country at this stage. His name was Adolf Eichmann, a name that might ring some bells with you, because he later became the architect of the final solution, the transports of Jews to their deaths at Auschwitz and other death camps in Poland. And if you remember your history, Eichmann was captured by the Israelis and was executed in 1961. But here he is the head of so-called Jewish emigration. As Gertrude arrives in Vienna to parley with him, she's immediately arrested as a spy and taken to local police cells, where she spends the whole night banging on the bars of the police cell, demanding to be let out and saying, "You'll be in trouble because I've got an appointment to meet your boss, Adolf Eichmann." She's eventually released, and sure enough goes to meet Eichmann, who is incredibly sarcastic with her. He says, "I can't understand why you, an Aryan Christian, should take any interest in Jewish children. I can't understand it. Are you sure you're not Jewish? Show me your knees." And she had to raise her skirt there in the office, all part of the humiliation technique, because Eichmann believed that Aryans had different shaped knees to the Jews. So there was this encounter, which I described fully in the book, which comes from Gertrude's own memoir, which is only in Dutch. Eventually, Eichmann says, "Look, and this is exactly what he said in German, but the translation is, I know, let's have a prank. It's Tuesday today. If by Saturday you can get 600 children on a train to England, I will allow 10,000 to leave." She had then 4 or 5 days to organize the transports of 600 children and get permissions from their parents, choose who the children should be, liaise with Lola Hahn-Warburg in London, telling her which children are going to come and where they're going to go once they were here. All that had to be done, amazingly, in 5 days. And by Saturday, which was the day that Eichmann insisted on having the first transport because it was Jewish Sabbath, and he knew that would be extra humiliating, But on the Sabbath, that Saturday, December the 12th, 1938, 600 children leave Vienna bound for safety. That was the largest Kindertransport in the entire Kindertransport history. Now, bless him, Sir Nicholas Winton saved 669 children from Prague over 8 months. She, in one transport, gets 600 children on the train and then continues with hundreds, thousands more over the next few months. You can see now, can't you, why I'm so passionate about letting these unforgotten names come to the fore. And she is a remarkable lady. I don't think even Hollywood could make up the rest of her story, which I haven't got time to tell you. But again, I plead to anyone out there to write a biography, which there isn't, of Gertrude Wijsmuller-Meijer. Quite remarkable woman. I also wanted to mention, I mentioned in the book, this chap. He's called Wilfred Israel. He was a German Jewish, but he had the luck to be born in London and had a joint passport, joint British German passport. And that meant that he was a little more free to travel around Germany under the Nazi gaze and help organize the Kindertransports from Germany. He also had something else going for him, that he was head of what I guess is the equivalent of the German Harrods. The department store, N. Israel and Sons Limited, was the poshest department store in Berlin. It was so posh that the senior Nazis did all their shopping there. And guess what? It was the only Jewish property not to be destroyed on the night of Kristallnacht because, and this is true, Goebbels said it, we haven't yet done our Christmas shopping. So the order went out not to destroy an Israel and Sons department store. But in the meantime, Wilfred Israel, again, amazing story to tell, but I haven't got time to tell you all of it, shuttles back from London to Germany, which the London Jews certainly were not able to do. He shuttles backwards and forwards to set up the whole Kindertransport program, particularly from Germany. Whereas Gertrude is involved in the Austrian one, he's involved very much in the German one. But doesn't act alone. I always say this, this idea that there are individual heroes who act alone, like superheroes, is never the case in history. There is always a team of people. And he led a team, again, mostly of women who worked for the Jewish agencies in Berlin. And I'm going to give you two names. Käthe Rosenheim, who was head of the Children's Emigration Department of the German Jewish organization in Berlin. And it's reckoned that she probably saved about 7,000 children, not on Kindertransport only, but to go to other countries like mandated Palestine and so on. And this lady, Hannah Kaminsky, who was head of the League of the Jewish, so-called League of Jewish Women, the Jüdische Freienbund. That was really important because the League of Jewish Women is like the WI, it's the Jewish version of the WI. And they had offices, they had departments in almost every major town and city in Germany. So if you were a parent desperate to get your little child on a Kindertransport train, you had two options. You went to your local Quaker friend's house, or you went to the office of the League of Jewish Women. And they would send all the material and papers back to Hannah, who led the whole organization from Berlin. But more than that, Hannah spent, I don't know how many times, coming backwards and forwards, being a chaperone to the youngest children, because some of the Kindertransport children were 3 and 4 years old, coming without their parents. And she would hold their hand, come to London, go back again, back again, back again, back again. People begged her to stay because they knew that she was in danger, being a very high profile person. But she said, no, I've got more children to save. And she kept going back to Berlin to repeat the Kindertransports. But look at the date of death, 1942. Look at Käthe Rosenheim's date of death. That 1942-43 always sends a chill through my bones because it means she didn't escape the clutches of the Nazis. And like Käthe Rosenheim and all her female and some male team members, they were carted off to Auschwitz in 1942 and murdered there. So there possibly is a reason why we don't know her name very well, because she didn't survive. But again, I think it's duty bound to remember people like her when we're thinking of this child rescue. Let's look now at this lady. She's called Bertha Bracy, and she was head of the British Quakers, if there is a head, and it's a very flat organization, but she was the general secretary of the Society of Friends during the 1930s. Again, why isn't there a book about her? Because she is, again, I'm repeating myself, saying remarkable people. They were all incredibly remarkable. She begins her rescue of endangered Jews doesn't wait for Kristallnacht. She starts in 1933 with the election of Hitler to the chancellorship in Germany. So she's already got an organization called the Germany Emergency Committee, sets up in March 33 to get as many Jewish families out as she can. But by Kristallnacht, she and her Quakers around the UK and the ones in Germany are working really night and day, literally, to organize as many escapes as they can. So she is the one who goes to Samuel Hall on the 21st of November in the morning, leading the delegation to ask or beg for him to waive the visas for the children. She's the one that's helped with Wilfred Israel set up the whole scheme with Helen Bentwich. I say in the book, it's not really quite clear who was responsible. It's one of those three, or maybe all three: Bentwich, Bracy, and Wilfred Israel. I'm not content with doing that. She then, once the children are here, sets up a remarkable series of supportive institutions once the children are here. She finds families for the children, Quaker families, schools, boarding schools, hostels, all run and paid for by the Quakers throughout the war. The Quakers have a remarkable history in the helping of refugees during this period. And she is the top notch. She's the person at the top of the tree who never seems to waver. And very, very remarkably, in 1943, I think, very early on, she gets the MBE for her services to refugees. That was almost unheard of, that such people would be recognized in such a way. So she's a remarkable figure. And I used to say when I started giving this talk a year ago, why did anyone have the gumption to go and interview her? Because she lived until 1989. She could have been on That's Life with Nicholas Winton. She could have had her own program, a documentary. And I said, why didn't anyone think of doing it? And then someone pointed out to me, could show the screen here, you've got that wrong. She was interviewed by the Imperial War Museum, and there is a recording of her from 1980 telling the whole story about how she got involved in the Kindertransport and other refugee rescues. So, I was going to play it, but I think we'll leave that for another time, maybe. By the way, after the war, tirelessly, she sets up a Quaker organization to help the survivors of the Second World War, still rootless and homeless in Germany. And I don't just mean Jews now. She sets up an organization to help German survivors who've lost everything after the war. And she said, that was my role, to not see anyone as a perpetrator, but as all human beings. So a very, very fascinating character, just the kind of person you need at a time of crisis. I wonder, where are the Bertha Braces of today? They're out there somewhere, maybe they're in this audience. A name that might surprise you, Alan Sainsbury. We mentioned Lord Marks, Simon Marks, but this is on the right-hand side is Alan Sainsbury, who in 1938 was head of the Sainsbury grocery firm. By the way, Alan Sainsbury is the one that we can either blame or praise for bringing self-service supermarkets to the UK in 1950. Sainsbury was the first to do that, and it was his idea. Anyway, in our story, Alan Sainsbury and his brother Robert, who's very well known in Norwich for the Sainsbury Centre, hear on the radio about Kristallnacht and are determined to do something about it. And what they do about it is they hire or buy a house, a large house in South London, in Putney, and convert it almost overnight into a dormitory hostel for Jewish refugee children. And they personally, particularly Alan, personally guarantees 25 boys and girls from orphanages in Germany to come to England to be looked after in what was then called the Sainsbury Hostel, or the Sainsbury Home in Putney. And he continues to support and look after those children all the way through the war and beyond. And in this very rare photograph that was given to me by one of the Kinder survivors, you can see on the left a young man. He is a former Sainsbury Home boy who, as a grown-up, becomes an artist, an architect, and is presenting here Alan Sainsbury on the right with a drawing he's made of one of the Sainsbury shops in London. So even down to, you know, the Sainsbury name very much involved in the Kindertransport program. I also wanted to mention this guy, Frank Bond. Frank Bond was the manager of the Dovercourt Bay holiday camp. Now that's a very important place because it was 2 miles away from the Harwich port. It still is. Dovercourt is still there. It's not going away. Helen Bentwich came up with a brilliant idea that if we can't find homes for the children when they arrive, then maybe they can stay at the nearby holiday camp, which was closed for the winter. It had 800 beds. However, who would look after it? Enter Frank Bond. Frank Bond was the manager of the holiday camp, like a Butlins, in the summer, and normally would be going off doing other things in the winter. But he volunteered to stay on with his wife, unpaid, to look after the Dovercourt camp for 4 months, during which time, I think, in my calculations, at least 1,500 children lived and arrived and lived and were fed, clothed and housed in this holiday camp at Dovercourt Bay. In fact, when the children left at the end of March, the camp closed for the summer season. The remaining boys, they were boys by then, created a giant welcome thank you card, which is in the Jewish Museum in London, this big, you know, signed by all these boys saying, "Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Bond, for everything that you've done for us." And one of the many things he did for them, for instance, was take them in a line in twos up the hill from the camp to the town cinema to watch the newly arrived Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first full-length cartoon film, which they'd never seen anything like before. And free ice creams and sweeties were given to them. That was one of many treats that Bond said. And Bond said, "It's been a privilege to know these boys and girls. And my view is, if you see someone hurt in the streets, you go and help them." He told the local newspaper at the time. So I wanted to, in the book, commemorate Frank Bond and his wife at the Dovercourt camp. One little coda to this story is that in 1946, the camp reopened as a summer holiday camp. Some of you may remember Warner's holiday camps. It was a rival to Butlins. By 1980, the holiday camp was the whole holiday camp world was slowing down. People were going abroad and not going to holiday camps. But there's one lifeline thrown to the Dovercourt Bay camp by the BBC, who decided to use the camp as the location for a series called Heidi High. When you see Heidi High, the chalets in the camp are the ones the children stayed in 1938. And in fact, I wrote an exhibition in Harwich called "From Hitler to Heidi High" about the Kindertransport history of the camp. I'm going to whiz on, so I'm just looking at the time. I'm going to finish off with this gentleman, Rabbi Solomon Schonfeld. Very orthodox, so these days we would call him ultra-orthodox, a Jew, born in London in 1912. And not for him, Helen Bentwich's committee. He was a maverick of mavericks. He didn't like working with committees, and so he set up his own Schonfeld Kindertransport, bringing children in trains that he and his congregants had paid for, bringing mostly Orthodox Jewish boys and girls. Most German Jews were not Orthodox, they were liberal or not religious at all, and he was very concerned about the Orthodox ones. And he brought, we think, about 700 Orthodox boys and girls over to be housed in hostels, in schools, in private homes, and so on. And again, you can't make this up, the sorts of thing that Schonfeld got into. He looks, you can see him here with a military uniform. This is the uniform of the army of Rabbi Schonfeld. He designed it himself after the war in order to fool people that he was a senior British military officer. And in fact, on the cap badge, it says Office of the Chief Rabbi. And the reason why he did that was because he was very concerned about Jewish survivors, particularly children who'd survived the camps. And he wanted to get visas for them. And being in uniform, he could march into the Polish embassy, the Romanian consulate, whatever. They thought he was some very senior British general, and therefore gave him permission for the children to leave. I'll just finish off with one more story. In 1943, he's concerned that the 800,000 Jews of Hungary are next on the list, which they were. 800,000 about to be sent off to Auschwitz on one of the Eichmann's trains. And so Rabbi Schonfeld goes to a rich person that he knew in Manchester. He says, I want £10,000. And with that £10,000, I'm going to buy a Caribbean island, which he did. Bought a Caribbean island. Why? Not to have a holiday. The Caribbean island was a British territory. And he thought that if he could make every one of the Hungary's 800,000 Jews a citizen of this Caribbean island, it would give them a bit more protection, being British as opposed to being Hungarian. It's a fantastic idea, which came to nothing because the Foreign Secretary at the time, then Anthony Eden, said this would mean negotiating with the Nazis, which we're not prepared to do. So the scheme came to nothing. But that's the kind of thing, tirelessly coming up with audacious schemes to get as many children out as he could, and adults as well. So those are just some of the 24, I think, unsung heroes I've got in the book. And I always wanted to finish with this, because apart from buying my book, which I hope you'll do, actually, I could ask you a favor. For some reason, can't seem to get this book into any local bookshops. So if you'd like to go into a bookshop and say, I'd like to buy Mike Levy's to get the children out, that might help encourage them to stock it. I'm also working with the US Holocaust Museum, trying to find British families like the Mrs. Gladys Roberts, who took in Kindertransport children, and interview any surviving siblings of those children. They would now be in their 90s. I've found 15 so far, and they will tell the story of how this German child came into their home in 1939 and what subsequently happened to them. No one until this point has done any research on this. So this will be the first time that such people have been found in interviews. Too late to interview the parents, sadly, but we can maybe just find the odd sibling. So if you know anyone that might fit this bill, I've already spoken to a lovely old chap called Michael Rogers in Norwich, who was part of a family that took in Kinder Trial. But if you know any others, do let me know. So that's as far as I've got. There's my book. It was published in February, and it tells all the other stories as well. So
my name's Beth Gardner-Smith, and I'm the Chief Executive of charity Safe Passage International. Since we began our work in 2015, we've helped thousands of young people fleeing danger to access safe routes to a place where they can be safe, reunite with family, and rebuild their lives. The terrible events of the last year, Afghanistan and now Ukraine, show us just how needed these safe routes are over 80 years on from the Kindertransport. By supporting Mike Levy's book, you are also supporting Safe Passage's work, as with each book purchased, £1 will be donated to help us continue our vital work, helping refugee children gain safe passage. Thank you again for extending the legacy of the Kindertransport to those who need it today.
Hello, thank you all so much for being here today to celebrate the launch of Mike Levy's book, Get the Children Out, Unsung Heroes of the Kindertransport. This book is particularly poignant for me. My name is Alf Dubbs, and I myself came across to the UK from Prague on the Kindertransport in July 1939. Without this safe route to the UK, there's no knowing if I would have survived, like many others who stayed behind. As we've been reminded in recent months, people are still fleeing danger, and the need for safe routes out of life-threatening situations is still there. Unfortunately, Often these routes don't exist, and people, including unaccompanied children, often feel forced to put their lives into the hands of people traffickers to reach safety. They are at risk of exploitation, trafficking, and drowning. Proceeds from the sale of this book go to Safe Passage, a charity that believes no child should have to risk their lives to reach a place of safety. They work to take children out of vulnerable situations so that they can reach a place of safety, reunite with children, and rebuild their lives. Thank you again for supporting this book so that we can extend the legacy of the Kindertransport to those who need it today.